A lot of mixed reaction to that medium-term budget policy statement. Investors don't seem to agree with it as the rand has lost ground against the US dollar. Opposition parties aren't impressed either. But what does this all mean for you and me? Well, I'm joined this evening by a political economist we have in Pretoria. That's Siyabenisa, who is going to help us unpack this mini-budget. We're also expecting in our Cape Town studio, let me just give you an idea of who'll be joining us, Mpotsebe, also an economist, and then we've got Tessa Dooms, who'll be coming in shortly. She's a social analyst and managing director of the Youth Lab. But let's go to Pretoria, where we've got Sia. Sia, very good evening. If you can hear me clearly there, just your overall impressions. I mean, this really wasn't great news already. We already knew that we were an economy in crisis, but did you expect anything better or anything different or a bit more of a glimmer of hope from the Finance Minister today?
Sure. No, I didn't expect anything much better, and I think the minister has served quite a bitter pill for a lot of people. But what I do believe, though, it may not be enough to solve the domestic fiscal and developmental challenges, but I do definitely think that he spoke or maybe resonated with those in power, primarily if you think of credit rating agencies and other financial institutions whose rating of South Africa matters, particularly if you think of our spending profile or borrowing profile rather. And the view is quite grim. However, I don't think that the minister, also given his constraints, given the power and mandate that he has done sufficiently enough to not only just coordinate the government, but I think he's done enough to ensure that South Africa is on a path towards implementing fiscal consolidation. You might remember that we started on this path of fiscal consolidation during the first term of former Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan, his first term, but there was very little in terms of implementation in spite of his freeze of certain government posts at certain levels, particularly management, which has had the negative consequence of leaving certain high-level posts at the National Treasury unmanned, so to speak. But now with this second sort of set of budget or policy decisions, the Minister of Finance is really tying the hands of government agencies as well as other national departments, and also the major shift in terms of the appropriation of the budget being now focused not on local government in terms of municipalities and local municipalities, but rather focused on the district, which is likely to shake or at least shift the political economy at the local government level, with major significant ramifications. Yeah,
with reference to what you say about fiscal sustainability, let's take a listen to what the Finance Minister had to say, that we are still, that fiscal sustainability is still a very long way off, saying that that's despite all the cuts and belt tightening, saying at least 150 billion rand is needed in the next 3 years. And speaking of one way to achieve this will be to cut the salaries of government officials, public servants and politicians. And believe it or not, those have increased by 66% in the last 10 years. Let's take a listen to what he had to say there.
Analysis of spending on public sector wages. It shows that, it's an interesting figure actually, it shows that 29,000 public servants, plus members of the National Executive, members of Parliament, members of the provincial executives and so forth, each earned more than 1 million rand last year. So they become millionaires. This is more than double the number of civil servants earning more than 1 million rand in 2006-07. So when members of the DA shout up and down, you must know that is because they are concerned about their status. The average wage increases across government was 6.8% in 2018-19, or 2.2% in above inflation.
All right, well, Sia, I have with me here my colleague from the Money Desk, Rafia Madzena. She has a couple of questions because she's been keeping an eye on the situation throughout the day from the time the speech started.
That's right.
What concerns you?
That's right, Vivek. And I mean, some things that have been said by Sia I find very interesting. Sia, just to pick your brain, so you say that the implementations that the minister looks to put in place are not sufficient, but the unions may argue that this cutting of the wage bill is something that they're going to fight tooth and nail. How does government, or Treasury rather, create that balancing act?
The focus, it needs to be a dual focus. That's the only way they're going to make a sustainable sort of compromise. At the moment, the minister is focused purely on the fiscal side in terms of the fiscal sustainability, but not really looking at the ramifications on the demand side, given that the National Treasury's mandate is to stimulate growth. And without demand, given the expected cut in wages, the growth's not going to be there. Without demand, there's not going to be the investment, at least not at the levels that are sufficient to stimulate growth. And so the only way to make a sort of worthy compromise is to look at this from both a fiscal side but also a demand side. Simplifying numbers such as saying a certain number of civil servants earn more than R1 million is to oversimplify the complex matter. We all understand that certain levels of tax, the tax bracket that those civil servants would be at is upwards of 40%, 45%. So you're looking at half of that in terms of net take-home pay, and that's really what people have to deal with in order to stimulate demand. This is also the similar approach and tack that former Minister of Finance had when he was mentioning Gigaba, when he mentioned the 1 percentile increase in VAT, which was simplified as a 1% increase, when in fact, when you look at the prices on the shelves, a 1 percentile increase translates to a real increase of around 16 to 20% in terms of the net increase in the price of food. That has had a much more significant impact on demand, in spite of it being quite good or conservative on the side of the fiscus. And now, remember, we're dealing with 3 times the kind of shortfall we dealt with at the time when we were increasing VAT, when we were trying to fund free education and the like. Now we're talking over 150 billion rand that needs to be sort of closed using these types of measures. And so for me, they're insufficient, but also they're much more focused on the fiscal balance rather than looking at a dual position of not just the fiscus, but the demand impact of these types of policy recommendations.
Thanks for that, Siyabonisa. Still with us for the rest of our conversation. We will be continuing to look at and analyze this medium-term budget through till 7 this evening.